The Sleepless Emperor. How Justinian rebuilt the world and nearly destroyed it. Part 1. The Nika Riots. The city aflame. In the year 532, the greatest city on earth was on fire. Constantinople, the new Rome, the empire's glittering nerve center, the crossroads where east met west, where Silk roads terminated and Mediterranean currents converged, churned with rage. 30,000 voices thundered one word into the smoke-filled January sky. Nika, conquer. It was not supposed to be this way. The chariot races in the Hippodrome were meant to be entertainment, an escape valve for the city's tensions, a controlled channel for the passions of the mob. The Blues and the Greens, rival factions that organized not just racing teams, but entire social networks, political allegiances, neighborhood militias, had always been enemies. Their rivalry was ancient, bitter, sometimes bloody, but it was predictable, manageable, part of the city's rhythm. Until the day they united. The spark was simple. 2 criminals, 1 blue and 1 green, sentenced to hang for murder. The execution went wrong. The gallows broke. The condemned men fell into the monastery below, claiming sanctuary. The emperor refused to pardon them. And then, impossibly, the factions joined together. Not to save their men, but to burn the world that would kill them. The Hippodrome burned first, that massive oval stadium capable of holding 100,000 souls became an inferno. Flames licked up the tiered marble seats where senators and merchants had watched races for centuries. The imperial box, where the emperor himself presided, visible to all, the living symbol of Roman power, was engulfed in smoke that rose black and acrid into the winter air. The fire spread with terrifying speed. The great church of Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, built by Constantine's son Constantius II nearly 2 centuries earlier, collapsed into ash. Its roof beams, ancient cedar from Lebanon, became torches that lit the destruction of centuries of accumulated religious art. Mosaics of gold and blue glass melted into abstract puddles. Marble columns cracked from the heat, fracturing with sounds like thunderclaps. The baths of Zeuxippus, those magnificent public baths with their priceless bronze statues of heroes and poets, statues of Homer and Sophocles, of Alexander and Julius Caesar, melted in the flames. Bronze liquefied at over 1,000 degrees, running in molten rivers through the streets, pooling in low-lying areas where it would later solidify into grotesque abstract forms, memorial to destruction. The Senate House crumbled, that ancient building where the remnants of Roman Republican tradition still met to advise the emperor. The Augustaion, the great square where bronze monuments to emperors past gazed over the city, became a field of twisted metal and shattered stone. Justinian's own recently erected column toppled, the statue of him on horseback crashing into fragments. Statues toppled throughout the city. Ancient marble, carved by masters dead 500 years, shattered on cobblestones. The gold that gilded the palace roofs melted, running down the hill toward the Bosphorus in molten streams that caught the firelight, as if the city itself were bleeding wealth into the sea. For 5 days, the mob ruled. For 5 days, Constantinople belonged not to the emperor, but to the fury of its own people. Looters ransacked the mansions of the wealthy, dragging silks and silver into the streets. Tax collectors were dragged from their homes and beaten, sometimes killed. The city's granaries were broken open, their contents distributed or burned in gestures of pure, nihilistic rage. This was not just a riot. It was revolution, raw and uncontrolled, threatening to overturn the entire social order that had held the empire together for centuries. Inside the palace, a man unraveling. Inside the great palace, Emperor Justinian paced. He was 50 years old, sharp-featured, with dark eyes that never seemed to close. Those who served him swore he never slept, that they would see lamplight in his chambers long past midnight, that couriers would arrive at dawn to find him already working, surrounded by documents, maps, theological treatises. The Sleepless Emperor, they called him, though never to his face. Now those sleepless eyes stared toward the harbour, where imperial ships waited, sails prepared, provisions loaded. Escape, exile, survival. The advisors whispered it. The generals murmured it. Even some of his own officials suggested it with increasing urgency. Better to flee and rebuild than to die in a palace consumed by flames and rage. The mob had already announced their replacement, Hypatius, a nephew of the former emperor Anastasius. The senators, those aristocrats who had never fully accepted Justinian, the peasant's nephew, the Illyrian upstart, were gathering in secret, ready to crown a new Augustus. All of Justinian's dreams, the restoration of Rome's glory, the recovery of the lost western provinces, the codification of law, the building of churches that would proclaim God's majesty, all of it was turning to ash before it had even begun. 5 years. He had been emperor for only 5 years, and already his reign was collapsing into chaos. The roar grew closer. Nika, Nika, Nika. And then, another voice cut through the chaos. Calm, cold, utterly female. Theodora, the woman who saved an empire. She entered the council chamber while the generals debated routes to the harbour. The Empress, a woman whose past should have barred her from ever touching silk, let alone wearing purple, looked at the assembled men with something between contempt and pity. Theodora had been raised in the Hippodrome's shadow, daughter of Cassius, a bear-keeper for the Greens. When her father died, she and her sisters had been left with nothing. Her mother, desperate, had paraded them before the crowd during a race day, hoping the Greens would take pity and employ them. The Greens had refused, the Blues had accepted. That moment, that childhood humiliation, had shaped Theodora's entire understanding of power. Mercy was arbitrary. Security was fragile. The only certainty was strength. She became an actress, which in that age meant performer, courtesan, entertainer, scandal. She had travelled to North Africa, lived lives that Roman matrons whispered about in horror, learned to read men and situations with uncanny accuracy. And yet she possessed an intellect as sharp as a Persian blade and a will that could bend iron. When Justinian met her, he did not see a concubine to be used and discarded. He saw an equal. He saw someone whose survival instincts matched his own ambition, whose strategic mind could match his vision. He changed the law itself to marry her, elevating her from the theatres to the throne. And now, in the empire's darkest hour, she would prove why. She looked at her husband and spoke words that would be carved into history. As to the belief that a woman ought not to be daring among men, or to assert herself boldly among those who are holding back from fear, I consider that the present crisis most certainly does not permit us to discuss whether the matter should be regarded in this or in some other way. She paused. My opinion, then, is that the present time, above all others, is inopportune for flight, even though it brings safety. For while it is impossible for a man who has seen the light not also to die, for one who has been an emperor, it is unendurable to be a fugitive. May I never be separated from this purple, and may I not live that day on which those who meet me shall not address me as mistress. Then came the line that would echo through empires. If now it is your wish to save yourself, O Emperor, there is no difficulty. For we have much money, and there is the sea, here the boats. However, consider whether it will not come about after you have been saved that you would gladly exchange that safety for death. For as for myself, I approve a certain ancient saying that royalty is a good burial shroud. Royalty is a good burial shroud. Purple makes a noble grave. If flight meant life without a throne, then death wearing the imperial purple, was the better choice. Something hardened in Justinian's eyes. The despair burned away. The ships would remain at anchor. The palace would stand. And the mob would learn what it meant to challenge an emperor who chose death over exile. The trap springs shut. The orders were given in whispers, carried by trusted men to trusted commanders. Narses, the aged eunuch, whose political cunning was legendary, was sent into the streets with bags of gold. He moved through the mob like a shadow, finding the leaders of the Blues, reminding them of old loyalties, of the emperor's past generosity, of the danger of crowning a new Augustus who would owe them nothing. Gold changed hands. Promises were whispered. Doubt was sown. Meanwhile, General Belisarius, the greatest military commander the empire possessed, gathered his forces. He had limited men, perhaps only a few thousand reliable troops. But Belisarius had his personal retainers, Herulians, Goths, hardened veterans who had fought Persians and survived, men who understood discipline, who obeyed orders without question. The mob, swollen with confidence, had gathered in the Hippodrome to crown their new emperor. 30,000 people packed into that massive oval stadium. Hypatius sat reluctantly in the imperial box, a crown pressed onto his unwilling head by senators who thought they could control him. They did not notice when the exits were sealed. Belisarius entered through the Blue Gate. Mundus entered through the Dead Gate. Their troops formed tight ranks, no speeches, no warnings, just the terrible efficiency of imperial vengeance. The slaughter lasted hours. 30,000 voices that had chanted Nika fell silent, one by one, until the Hippodrome's sand was dark with blood. Men tried to scale the walls and were cut down. Others pressed toward the sealed gates, crushing each other in panic, dying by suffocation before the swords could reach them. The senators who had plotted rebellion died alongside the common people they had manipulated. The Blues who had taken Narses' gold slipped away through passages they had been shown, while their former allies died by the thousands. Hypatius was dragged before Justinian and executed the next day. His body was thrown into the sea. When night finally returned to Constantinople, silence reigned where 30,000 voices had roared. The streets were empty except for corpses and ash. The fires had burned out, leaving skeletal ruins. The smell of smoke and death hung over the city like a shroud. But Justinian had survived. More than survived. He had demonstrated what it meant to challenge his rule. From that moment forward, the senators would never dare plot against him. The factions would never unite against the throne. The people would remember the Hippodrome's bloody sand for generations. From that silence, a new world would rise, one ruled by an emperor who now trusted only two things: God and himself. Part 2. The Architect. Hagia Sophia. From ruin, a vision. The city was in ruins, but for Justinian, ruin was opportunity. Where others saw devastation, he saw a blank canvas. Where others saw loss, he saw possibility. The old Hagia Sophia had been consumed by flames during the riots. Its columns had cracked, its roof had collapsed, its mosaics had melted into abstract puddles of gold and blue. Justinian ordered the rubble cleared. But he did not intend to rebuild what had been lost. He intended to create something that had never existed before, a structure that would make every church that came before it seem like a crude sketch. He would build heaven on earth. Nothing less would do. The mathematicians of God. The emperor summoned two men whose names would be linked with his own for eternity, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus. They were not architects in the traditional sense. They were mathematicians, geometers, philosophers, men who thought not in stone and mortar, but in curves and light, in ratios and proportions that echoed the mathematical harmonies underlying creation itself. Anthemius had written treatises on burning mirrors and conic sections. Isidore had compiled the works of Archimedes and studied the properties of the vault. Justinian told them, "Build a church beyond comprehension. Build something that will make men believe they have stepped from earth into heaven itself." Their response was to design something that defied every principle of architecture known to mankind. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. A massive dome, more than 100 feet in diameter, to be suspended above a square base. No church had ever attempted such a thing on such a scale. The Pantheon in Rome had a dome, yes, but it rested on circular walls of massive thickness. Anthemius and Isidore proposed to hang their dome on 4 great arches, leaving the walls below pierced with windows, as if the solid stone that should support such weight could be replaced with light itself. It was architecture as theology. The square, representing the earth, the cardinal directions, the material world, would be transformed into a circle, representing heaven, eternity, divine perfection. The transformation would occur through the pendentive, that brilliant geometric solution that allowed a circular dome to rest on square supports. And the whole structure would seem to float, held up not by mass, but by grace. The building of miracles. 10,000 men worked in shifts, day and night, for 5 years. But these were not merely laborers hauling stone. They were specialists, masters of crafts that had been perfected over centuries. The quarrymen who extracted the marble had to understand geology, had to read stone like scholars read texts. A crack invisible to the untrained eye could doom an entire column. They selected blocks with the precision of surgeons, knowing that each piece would be judged not just by engineers, but by an emperor who accepted nothing less than perfection. The materials were gathered from across the known world, each source chosen for specific properties. Marble came from Ephesus, green stone veined with white, like spring growth breaking through snow. Porphyry was quarried in Egypt, that deep purple stone so rare it had been reserved for emperors since Augustus Caesar himself. Yellow stone from North Africa that caught sunlight like captured honey. Pink granite from Aswan that seemed to blush under lamplight. Green marble from Thessaly that held shadows like pools of dark water. The logistics were staggering. Ships had to be chartered, routes planned, harbours prepared. A single column might weigh 10 tons. Moving it from quarry to ship required specialised equipment, cranes, rollers, teams of oxen, crews of men who understood leverage and balance. Loading it onto a ship required calculating weight distribution to prevent the vessel from capsizing. Unloading in Constantinople meant coordinating with harbour officials, arranging transportation through crowded streets, delivering it to the construction site without damage. Multiply this by thousands of pieces, columns, capitals, floor panels, decorative elements, and you begin to understand the organisational complexity. This was logistics on an imperial scale, requiring administrators as much as architects, bureaucrats as much as builders. 8 columns of green porphyry from the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, were transported to Constantinople and incorporated into the new church. These columns were already 1,000 years old, had supported the temple to the goddess Artemis that had drawn pilgrims from across the ancient world. Now they would support a Christian church, the old wonders literally being incorporated into the new pagan antiquity being baptized into Christian modernity. The symbolism was deliberate. Justinian was not just building a church, he was claiming continuity with the greatest achievements of the past, asserting that Christian Rome was the rightful heir to everything that had come before. The columns alone were marvels, 107 in total, each precisely measured, each placed according to mathematical harmonies that echoed the Pythagorean music of the spheres. They formed patterns, numerical relationships, geometric progressions that embodied beauty itself. The spacing between columns, the relationship between height and diameter, the proportions of capital to shaft, all followed ratios that philosophers believed reflected cosmic order. This was architecture as mathematics, building as philosophy. Every measurement had meaning. Every proportion held significance. The church was designed to be not just beautiful, but cosmically correct, aligned with the fundamental harmonies of creation itself. The workforce was a cross-section of the empire, skilled craftsmen from Anatolia who had learned their trade from masters who had learned from masters, stretching back generations. Engineers from Alexandria, that great center of Hellenistic learning, who understood mechanics and mathematics. mosaic artists from Syria whose work had decorated churches and palaces across the east, stone carvers from Greece who could make marble seem soft as cloth. They worked in teams, each specializing in particular tasks. The mosaicists alone required years of training. Creating the golden backgrounds meant cutting tiny cubes of glass, tesserae, and setting them at slight angles so they would catch and reflect light differently. The gold was real gold leaf, sandwiched between layers of glass, creating a luminous surface that seemed to generate its own light. The work was dangerous. Men fell from scaffolding and died. Stone dust filled the lungs of carvers, slowly killing them over years. The heat from the lime kilns, necessary for making mortar, was intense enough to cause permanent damage. Workers died in accidents, from disease, from exhaustion. Their names were not recorded, their graves are unmarked, but their work endures. Justinian visited the construction site constantly, imperious, demanding, obsessive. He would arrive unannounced, climbing scaffolding to inspect work in progress, questioning decisions, demanding explanations. He wanted perfection, and he believed that constant surveillance would achieve it. The workers learned to recognize his approach, the sudden stillness that rippled through the site, the whispered warnings, the quick adjustments as men tried to ensure their work would pass imperial inspection. He was not a cruel overseer, but he was an unforgiving one. Excellence was expected, not praised. Mistakes were noted and punished. The message was clear. You are building for eternity, and eternity demands perfection. The costs were staggering. The imperial treasury poured out gold, as if fiscal restraint had ceased to exist, as if money were merely another material to be consumed in construction. Historians would later calculate that the construction consumed the equivalent of £300,000 to £20,000 of gold, an amount that represented roughly 5 years of the empire's total tax revenue. To put this in context, it was more than had been spent on all other imperial building projects of the previous century combined. Where did this money come from? From taxes, naturally, but not just from Constantinople or even just from the eastern provinces. The entire empire paid for Hagia Sophia. Egyptian grain farmers contributed. Syrian merchants contributed. Anatolian shepherds contributed. Every province, every taxpayer, every subject of the empire was, in a sense, building this church. Many did so willingly, seeing it as a holy work. Many did so resentfully, seeing it as imperial vanity. But all did so, whether willing or not, because the alternative was punishment. And yet, somehow, miraculously, the mathematics worked. The pendentives, those brilliant triangular sections that allowed the circular dome to rest on the square base, transferred the dome's weight to the 4 great arches. The arches transferred it to massive piers hidden within the walls, piers that extended deep into bedrock. And between these structural elements, the walls could be opened up, pierced with windows that filled the interior with light that seemed to have no earthly source. The engineering was revolutionary. No one had attempted anything like this before on such a scale. Anthemius and Isidore were working at the edge of what was possible with the materials and mathematics available to them. They were pushing stone to do things stone should not be able to do. And it worked. Not perfectly. The original dome would partially collapse in an earthquake in 558, requiring reconstruction with a slightly higher profile. But it worked well enough to stand for 15 centuries, well enough to inspire countless imitations, well enough to prove that human genius, given sufficient resources and will, could achieve miracles. The dome that touched heaven. When the dome was finally lifted into place, that impossible hemisphere, it appeared to hang from heaven itself. The base of the dome was pierced with 40 windows, arranged in a perfect circle. During the day, sunlight streamed through these windows, creating the illusion that the dome floated on a ring of light. The golden mosaics that covered the interior caught and multiplied this light, so that the entire space seemed to glow with its own internal radiance. At night, thousands of oil lamps were lit in concentric circles, their flames reflected in the polished marble and gold leaf, creating a different kind of illumination, warmer, more intimate, yet no less transcendent. The church became a vessel of light, a lantern visible from ships approaching Constantinople's harbours. The interior space was vast beyond anything Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. The dome rose 180 feet above the floor, as high as a 15-story building. The main nave stretched 250 feet in length. But these raw dimensions failed to capture the actual experience. What struck visitors was not the size, but the quality of the interior. The way the light seemed to dissolve solid matter. The way the massive structure seemed weightless. The way every surface caught and reflected illumination, until the boundaries between wall and ceiling, stone and air, earth and heaven seemed to blur. The historian Procopius wrote that the church seemed suspended by a golden chain from heaven. He described how a spherical-shaped dome makes it exceedingly beautiful. From the lightness of the building, it does not appear to rest upon a solid foundation, but to cover the place beneath as though it were suspended from heaven by the fabled golden chain. This was not hyperbole. It was an attempt to describe an experience for which no adequate words existed. Solomon, I have surpassed thee. On December 27th, 537, 5 years and 10 months after construction began, the church was consecrated. Justinian entered alone, ahead of the priests and dignitaries. He walked down the long nave, his footsteps echoing in that vast space, his eyes lifted to the dome that seemed to float above him. The light streaming through the windows created shafts of illumination that looked solid, as if one could climb them to heaven. He raised his hands to the sky and spoke words that would become legend. Nenikika se, Solomon. Solomon, I have surpassed thee. It was an extraordinary claim. Solomon, the builder of the first temple in Jerusalem, the wisest king in Jewish history, the man whom God had blessed with wisdom beyond measure, Justinian was declaring that his achievement exceeded even that legendary standard. But in that moment, standing beneath that impossible dome, with light streaming through windows that should not have been possible, with stone seemingly transformed into something lighter than air, the claim did not seem like hubris. It seemed like simple statement of fact. Hagia Sophia was not just architecture, it was theology made tangible. It was a statement that the Roman Empire, this Christian Roman Empire that had survived the fall of the West, still commanded the resources, the genius, and the divine favor to accomplish miracles. The dome's shimmering curve became the new symbol of order, the mosaic completed after chaos. Every visitor who entered would understand without words that this empire was chosen by God, blessed by heaven, destined to endure forever. The shadow price. But every miracle casts a shadow. Every achievement this grand demands payment. The construction of Hagia Sophia had required a complete reorganization of the empire's finances. Taxes were raised across every province. New levies were imposed on trade, on agricultural production, on inheritance. The emperor's tax collectors squeezed every possible solidus from a population still recovering from the Nika Riots. The poor paid most heavily. Peasants who had barely enough to feed their families found themselves forced to surrender grain to feed the 10,000 workers. Artisans who had lost their workshops in the riots discovered that the imperial priority was not rebuilding their livelihoods, but glorifying God, or more accurately, glorifying the emperor who claimed to speak for God. Provincial governors complained that they could not maintain roads, aqueducts, or fortifications because all resources were being diverted to Constantinople. The empire's military budget was strained. Diplomatic gifts to barbarian kings, the bribes that kept the frontiers quiet, were delayed or reduced. And Justinian did not care. Or perhaps he cared, but considered the cost acceptable. The Church of Light was being built upon the darkness of exhaustion, upon the suffering of people whose names would never be recorded, whose contributions would never be acknowledged. Years later, when earthquakes caused the original dome to partially collapse and required reconstruction, the pattern would repeat. More taxes, more levies, more burden on a population that had already given everything. This was the bargain Justinian made. Immortality purchased with exhaustion, glory built on suffering, heaven reflected in a structure that cast earthly shadows across an empire. But the dome rose anyway and caught the light and proclaimed to everyone who saw it that some achievements transcend their cost. That beauty, once created, justifies the sacrifice required to bring it into existence. Hagia Sophia stands today, nearly 1,500 years later. The empire that built it is dust. The tax collectors are forgotten. The workers have no names. But the dome endures, still catching the light, still proclaiming that once, long ago, human beings reached upward and touched something that might have been heaven. Was it worth the cost? Ask that question in the cold light of history, and you might say no. But stand beneath that dome, feel the light washing over you, sense the mathematical perfection made manifest in stone, and the question itself seems to dissolve. Some things are worth what they cost, even when the price is terrible. This was Justinian's philosophy, and Hagia Sophia was its first and greatest expression. Part 3. The Lawgiver, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Empire of Words. If Hagia Sophia was Justinian's monument in matter, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, was his monument in mind. For 1,000 years, Roman law had sprawled in magnificent, chaotic contradiction. Decrees were piled upon decrees, dead emperors contradicting living ones, obsolete statutes gathering dust alongside current regulations. No judge could find truth in the tangle. No lawyer could master the entirety. The empire's legal spirit was trapped in its own words. Justinian wanted order, and order begins with law. Not the brutal order of the Hippodrome massacre, though that too had its place, but the patient, precise, intellectual order that could be written down, transmitted across centuries, applied consistently across provinces. This would be his subtlest conquest and his most enduring. When his armies had crumbled to dust, when Hagia Sophia's dome had been converted to serve another faith, when even the name Byzantium had become a scholar's curiosity, Justinian's law would still be teaching judges how to think. The master of law. He gathered scholars led by Tribonian, the Quaestor Sacri Pallati, the master of sacred petitions, whose legal mind was considered the finest in the empire. Tribonian was a pagan at heart, or so his enemies whispered, a man who valued Greek philosophy more than Christian theology, who saw law as an intellectual exercise rather than divine command. He had faced corruption charges. His reputation was complicated, but his genius was undeniable, and Justinian needed genius more than purity. Around Tribonian gathered a team of the empire's most brilliant legal scholars: Theophilus, a professor of law in Constantinople; Dorotheus, another professor, along with 16 advocates and assistants. They were given an impossible task: reduce 1,000 years of Roman legal tradition to something coherent, organized, usable. Eliminate contradictions. Preserve essential principles. Create a system that could guide both judges deciding cases today and legislators creating laws for tomorrow. They locked themselves away for years. Literally, they worked in secure chambers in the imperial palace, surrounded by mountains of parchment, ancient scrolls, mouldering codices pulled from libraries across the empire. They read everything: the edicts of Augustus, the rulings of Hadrian, the legal opinions of Gaius and Ulpian and Papinian. They argued, they debated, they edited with ruthless efficiency, cutting passages that no longer applied, harmonizing contradictions, imposing order on chaos. Where ancient jurists had disagreed, they chose the interpretation that seemed wisest. Where old laws conflicted with current practice, they updated the language. Where gaps existed in legal logic, they filled them. The work was audacious beyond measure. These men were rewriting the words of the greatest legal minds Rome had ever produced. They were editing Augustus. They were condensing Hadrian. They were presuming to correct Ulpian. And they were doing it all under the authority of an emperor who believed, who genuinely, deeply believed, that he was ordained by God to restore Roman greatness. 4 pillars of civilization. From this linguistic chaos, they birthed 4 masterpieces, each serving a distinct purpose, together forming a complete legal system, the Codex Justinianus. First came the Codex, a collection of all valid imperial constitutions from Hadrian onward, organized by subject rather than chronology. For the first time, a judge could look up property law or criminal procedure and find all relevant edicts in one place, purged of contradictions, updated for current conditions. The first edition appeared in 529. A revised edition followed in 534. It contained roughly 4,500 laws, distilled from centuries of imperial legislation. The Digest, or Pandects. Next came the Digest, the Pandects, perhaps the most remarkable legal compilation ever created. Tribonian's team took the writings of 39 classical jurists, distilled 3 million lines of text down to 150,000 lines, organized them into 50 books covering every aspect of private law. Property, contracts, torts, inheritance, family law, all of it reduced to essential principles, illustrated with examples, explained with crystalline clarity. The Digest preserved Roman legal thought that would otherwise have been lost forever. Many of the original texts it excerpted no longer exist. We know them only through these carefully chosen passages. It was completed in just 3 years, an astonishing feat. The Institutes. The Institutes served as a textbook for law students, a systematic introduction to legal principles that could take someone with no background from basic concepts through increasingly complex applications. It was based on the earlier Institutes of Gaius, but updated for Justinian's time. This was revolutionary. The idea that law should be teachable, that its principles could be systematically conveyed to the next generation, that legal education could be standardized across the empire, the novellae. Finally, the novellae, the new laws, collected Justinian's own legislative innovations. These were laws he enacted after the Codex was published, covering everything from church administration to military organization to the rights of women. Interestingly, many of these were written in Greek rather than Latin, reflecting the reality that the empire's center of gravity had shifted eastward. The architecture of justice. Together, these 4 works became not merely Justinian's law, but Western civilization's legal DNA. They established principles that seem obvious to us now, but were revolutionary at the time. That law should be written down and publicly accessible. That similar cases should be decided similarly. That legal reasoning should follow logical principles rather than arbitrary whim. That judges should explain their decisions, not merely pronounce them. That contracts should be enforced according to their terms, not the relative power of the parties. That even emperors ruled under law, not above it. The Corpus Juris created the first rational architecture of human justice. It said that government stood above individuals, that principle outweighed passion, that empire could exist through law rather than merely through force. It transformed law from a collection of arbitrary commands into a coherent system of thought, something that could be studied, taught, applied, improved upon. The immortal influence. The irony is profound. Justinian's military conquests barely outlasted his death. The Italian provinces he recovered were lost within decades. Africa fell to Islamic conquest. The Western Empire he tried to restore never truly revived. But his legal work survived everything. Survived the fall of Constantinople. Survived the end of the Roman Empire itself. Survived centuries when no one even remembered who Byzantium was. In the 11th century, a manuscript copy of the Digest was rediscovered in Pisa. It sparked a revolution in European thought. Legal scholars devoured it, studied it, built entire universities around teaching it. The recovery of Roman law became one of the crucial intellectual events of the Middle Ages. From Bologna to Paris, from Oxford to Salamanca, students memorized passages from the Digest. They learned to think like Roman jurists, to analyze problems systematically, to distinguish principles from applications, to build arguments from precedent and logic rather than authority alone. This mode of thinking spread beyond law into philosophy, theology, political theory. It taught Europe how to think analytically about complex problems. The influence rippled outward through centuries. When the American founders drafted the Constitution, they drew on legal concepts ultimately derived from Justinian. When the European Union creates directives, it uses legal frameworks that trace back to Rome. When law schools teach contract law, tort law, property law, they are teaching doctrines that Tribonian's commission codified 1500 years ago. Justinian dreamed of eternity, and in words, he achieved it. Not through conquest, which is temporary, not through monuments, which crumble, but through ideas, those portable, transmissible, unkillable patterns of thought that survive empires and cross millennia. The Sleepless Emperor did not just rebuild Rome. He codified it, packaged it, transmitted it into a future he would never see. And that thought would have pleased him more than any military triumph ever could. The Corpus Juris Civilis was Justinian's truest victory. It was the one conquest that stuck. And unlike his military campaigns or architectural projects, it required no bloodshed, no exploitation, no crushing of the poor to glorify the powerful. If there is any part of Justinian's legacy that deserves pure admiration, it is this. He preserved and systematized the legal thought of classical Rome at the exact moment when it might have been lost forever. In doing so, he gave Western civilization one of its foundational texts, second in importance perhaps only to the Bible itself. Part 4. The General, the Reconquest. The dream of renovation. But the emperor was not content with laws or churches. His vision of Renovatio Imperii, the restoration of empire, demanded that the Roman world be whole again. The old western half, fallen to barbarians for nearly 100 years, would be reclaimed. The Vandals in Africa, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain. All these Germanic kingdoms that had carved up the corpse of Rome would be swept away. The Mediterranean would once again be a Roman lake. It was an audacious dream, perhaps even a mad one. The Western Empire had fallen in 476, more than 50 years before Justinian took the throne. Entire generations had been born and died under barbarian rule. The Germanic kings had converted to Christianity, built their own administrative systems, created their own legitimacy. But Justinian saw them as usurpers, temporary occupants of territories that belonged by right to Rome. And to reclaim those territories, he would unleash his greatest instrument, General Belisarius. Belisarius, the sword of empire. Flavius Belisarius was perhaps the last great Roman general, certainly the last who could stand comparison with Caesar or Scipio. He was tall, handsome, utterly loyal to Justinian, and possessed of that rare combination of tactical brilliance and strategic vision that appears perhaps once in a century. He had already proven himself against the Persians, winning a crucial victory at Dara that had stabilized the eastern frontier. He had commanded the troops that massacred the rioters in the Hippodrome. Now he would be given the greatest military challenge of the age, the reconquest of the West. In 533, he was sent to Africa with a fleet of 500 ships carrying perhaps 15,000 men, an absurdly small force to conquer a kingdom. But Belisarius made up for lack of numbers with speed, surprise, and tactical genius. The African campaign, speed and glory. The Vandal kingdom in North Africa was, on paper, formidable. The Vandals were descendants of the Germanic tribes who had humiliated Rome a century earlier. They had sacked the city in 455. looting treasures including sacred vessels from Solomon's temple. They controlled the richest agricultural lands in the Mediterranean, commanded a powerful fleet, and had ruled Africa for nearly 100 years. But they had grown soft. King Gelimer was absent when Belisarius landed, suppressing a rebellion in Sardinia. The Vandal army, unused to serious opposition, was scattered and unprepared. Belisarius struck with lightning speed. The first battle at Ad Decimum, 10 miles from Carthage, was a confused affair that Belisarius won more through nerve than skill. He held his forces together when the Vandals scattered. The second battle at Tricamarum was more decisive. Belisarius shattered the Vandal army, killed Gelimer's brother, and sent the king fleeing into the interior. Within months, Africa was Roman again. Carthage, that ancient rival whose destruction had made Rome supreme in the Mediterranean, was once more an imperial city. The Vandal kingdom, which had seemed permanent, dissolved like morning mist. Gelimer surrendered and was brought to Constantinople in chains, paraded through the streets in a triumph reminiscent of ancient Rome, then pensioned off to a comfortable retirement. It was the kind of victory that made conquest look easy. The lost provinces returned as offerings to the emperor who never slept. Justinian could point to Africa and say, "See, Rome is not dead. Rome is eternal. We are reclaiming what was always ours." But the triumph of Africa tempted fate. It made Justinian believe that all reconquest would be this swift, this clean, this glorious. Italy would teach him otherwise. The Italian campaign, liberation becomes devastation. In 535, Belisarius invaded Italy. The goal was the same as in Africa: overthrow the barbarian kingdom and restore Roman rule. But everything else was different. The Ostrogothic kingdom was larger, richer, and more deeply rooted than the Vandals had been. The Goths had ruled Italy for 60 years under able kings like Theodoric the Great. They had maintained Roman administrative structures, preserved Roman culture, even employed Roman officials. Many Italians viewed them not as foreign oppressors, but as legitimate rulers who had brought stability. At first, the campaign went well. Belisarius took Sicily with barely a fight, then crossed to mainland Italy. Cities opened their gates, welcoming the returning Romans. Naples fell after a siege. In December 536, Belisarius entered Rome itself, the Eternal City, the heart of the old empire, and the Gothic garrison withdrew without major resistance. But then the Goths rallied. They elected a new king, Vitiges, a capable general who understood that the survival of his people was at stake. He gathered a massive army, some sources say 150,000 men, and marched on Rome. What followed was one of the most famous sieges in history, the Siege of Rome. For a year and 9 days, Vitiges surrounded Rome with overwhelming force. Belisarius, trapped inside with perhaps 5,000 men, conducted a defense that showcased his tactical genius. He repaired sections of wall that had fallen into disrepair, positioned his troops to maximize defensive effectiveness, led counterattacks that kept the Goths off balance. He held the city through the kind of inspired leadership that makes names legendary. But the cost to Rome was terrible. The ancient aqueducts that had supplied the city with water for 1,000 years were cut. Food ran short, disease spread. The civilian population, caught between Gothic siege and Byzantine occupation, suffered horribly. When the siege finally ended, Vitiges withdrew when reinforcements arrived from Constantinople. Rome was saved but scarred. And the war was only beginning. The war that wouldn't end. The Gothic War dragged on for nearly 2 decades. What began as liberation became occupation, then devastation. The conflict became a grinding, brutal struggle that reduced Italy to ruin. The Goths elected a new king, Totila, who was both brilliant and ruthless. He understood that he couldn't match Byzantine discipline in open battle, so he avoided them. Instead, he raided supply lines, besieged cities, won over the Italian population by offering better treatment than the Byzantine tax collectors provided. Under Totila, the Gothic cause revived and flourished. He was everything Vitiges had not been: bold, innovative, personally brave, politically astute. He understood that this was not just a military conflict, but a struggle for the hearts of the Italian people. And increasingly, the Italians preferred the Goths. Byzantine rule meant heavy taxation to pay for wars the Italians hadn't wanted. It meant garrison troops who treated locals with contempt. It meant administrators more interested in extracting resources than providing services. The liberation had begun to feel like occupation, and occupation like exploitation. Totila offered an alternative. He cancelled debts, redistributed land to peasants, reduced taxes. He positioned himself not as a barbarian king, but as a legitimate Roman ruler. Perhaps more Roman than the distant emperor in Constantinople, who seemed to care about Italy only as a symbol to be reclaimed, not as a place where real people lived. Rome changed hands 3 times during the war, and with each change, the devastation deepened. In 546, Totila took the city after a long siege. He found a population starved and desperate. Rather than sack it, he considered abandoning it entirely, turning Rome, the eternal city, into pasture for goats. He reportedly sent messages to Justinian, suggesting that the city, having lost its strategic importance, should simply be left as ruins. Justinian's response was characteristically determined. Rome must be held, regardless of cost or practicality. The city was symbolic, representing everything his Renovatio Imperii stood for. To abandon Rome was to admit that the restoration was meaningless. So Belisarius returned and retook the city in 547. Then Totila besieged it again in 549, taking it a second time after the garrison and population were once again starved into submission. Then Byzantine forces retook it in 550. Each cycle of siege and capture left the city more damaged, more depopulated, more ruined. The population collapse was catastrophic. Rome, which had housed perhaps 500,000 people under the Ostrogoths, may have fallen to as few as 30,000 by the war's end. Entire neighborhoods, the Aventine Hill, parts of the Esquiline, vast sections of the Campus Martius, were simply abandoned. Buildings fell into ruin, streets were reclaimed by vegetation, wild animals began hunting in areas that had been densely urban for 1,000 years. The infrastructure that had made Rome possible collapsed. The Aqua Claudia, that magnificent aqueduct that had brought water to the city for 5 centuries, was cut multiple times by besieging armies. When the Goths cut the aqueducts in 537, they didn't just deprive the city of drinking water, they shut down the public baths, stopped the fountains, ended the grinding mills that produced flour. The entire hydraulic civilization that Rome represented simply ceased to function. Later, sieges saw the aqueducts deliberately destroyed, not just cut. Stone was pulled down to be reused. Arches were deliberately collapsed. By the war's end, Rome's water infrastructure, which had been one of the ancient world's greatest engineering achievements, was beyond repair. Without water, without mills, without functioning markets, Rome ceased to be an urban center in any meaningful sense. It became a fortified village scattered among ruins, a ghost of itself, a name without substance. The ancient monuments suffered terribly. The Colosseum was fortified and used as a strongpoint in urban fighting, its stones pockmarked by projectiles. The Pantheon, that perfect Roman temple, survived mostly intact, but saw its bronze fittings looted. The Forum, which had been the ceremonial and political heart of the ancient empire, became a cow pasture where peasants grazed animals among fallen columns. Ancient sculptures, those masterpieces of Greek and Roman art that had adorned the city for centuries, met various fates. Some were deliberately destroyed by Christians who saw them as pagan idols. Others were burned in lime kilns, the marble converted to quicklime for making mortar. Still others were simply toppled and left to break, their pieces slowly being buried under accumulating dirt and debris. Libraries that had survived for centuries were dispersed or destroyed. The city had been a repository of knowledge, housing copies of classical texts that existed nowhere else. In the chaos of repeated sieges and occupations, many of these were lost forever. Monks and scholars tried to save what they could, smuggling manuscripts to safer locations, but much was simply lost to fire, water damage, or casual destruction. The Senate, which had met continuously for over 1,000 years, held its last recorded session sometime around 550. The exact date is uncertain. Such was the chaos that no one bothered to record this momentous ending. The institution that had guided Rome from city-state to republic to empire, that had survived the transition to imperial rule, that had persisted through the fall of the Western Empire and Gothic rule, simply ceased to exist. There weren't enough senators left, the city was too dangerous. The meetings no longer served any purpose. Across the Italian countryside, the devastation was even worse, if less visible to history. Farms were abandoned as farmers fled the fighting, were conscripted by one side or the other, or were simply killed in the endless raids and counter-raids that characterized the conflict. The Po Valley, which had been one of the most productive agricultural regions in the Mediterranean, saw its irrigation systems collapse. Without maintenance, canals silted up, drainage systems failed, fields that had produced wheat for centuries returned to swamp. In the south, the situation was different, but equally bad. Here the fighting was less intense, but that almost made things worse. Armies from both sides would descend on rural areas to forage for supplies, stripping them clean, then moving on. This could happen multiple times in a season, each army taking what it needed without regard for whether the locals would have enough to survive winter. Fields that had produced grain for 1,000 years went fallow. Olive groves, which took decades to mature and represented generations of investment, were cut down for firewood. Vineyards were destroyed. The patient agricultural infrastructure that had supported Italy's prosperity was systematically demolished. Famine spread throughout the peninsula. The harvests of 538, 539, and 540 failed across much of Italy, partly from natural causes, but mainly because there weren't enough people to plant, maintain, and harvest crops. Those who remained were often too weak from hunger to work effectively. Disease followed famine with terrible inevitability. Plague struck Italy multiple times during the Gothic Wars, killing people already weakened by malnutrition. Typhus spread in overcrowded cities. Dysentery became endemic. The combination of war, famine, and disease created a demographic catastrophe from which Italy would take centuries to recover. The population of Italy, which scholars estimate might have been 6 to 7 million when Belisarius invaded, may have fallen by a third or even half by the time the war ended. Some regions were almost completely depopulated. Travelers in the 500s described journeying for days through abandoned countryside, seeing ruined farms but no living people, passing through villages that were entirely empty. When victory finally came in 554, when the last Gothic resistance was crushed and Italy was technically Roman again, it tasted like dust. The dream had been achieved on parchment. A reunited empire. Italy, restored to Roman control, the old heartland reclaimed. In reality, the West was rubble. The Gothic kingdom that Justinian had set out to destroy was indeed destroyed, but so was the Italy he had claimed to be saving. The liberation had become devastation. The restoration had become destruction. The cure had killed the patient, the emperor's suspicion. And through it all, Justinian demonstrated a fatal flaw: his inability to trust even his most loyal servants. Belisarius, who had saved the throne during the Nika Riots, conquered Africa, defended Rome, won victory after victory. Belisarius became suspect. Why? Because he was too successful, too popular with his troops, too acclaimed by the public. In Justinian's mind, shaped by decades of intrigue and survival, military success was inherently dangerous. Today's loyal general could be tomorrow's usurper. So, Belisarius was repeatedly recalled to Constantinople. Deprived of resources, placed under suspicion, Justinian sent other generals to replace him, then blamed them when they failed. He divided command, sowing discord among his own officers. He starved Italy of troops and supplies because he was simultaneously fighting Persia in the east and didn't trust anyone enough to give them adequate resources. There's a heartbreaking quality to Belisarius's loyalty. Despite being repeatedly humiliated, recalled at crucial moments, denied credit for his victories, even briefly imprisoned on trumped-up charges, he remained faithful. When Justinian needed him, he came. When he was dismissed, he went. He never rebelled, never plotted, never used his military reputation to challenge the emperor who so clearly feared him. The one man who might have preserved the Western conquests, who could have turned military victory into stable occupation, who possessed both the strategic vision and the tactical skill to make Renovatio Imperii a reality. That man was consistently undermined by the emperor he served. It was a tragedy born of Justinian's own psychology. The emperor who dreamed of reuniting Rome was too paranoid to trust the instruments necessary to achieve that dream, the hollow victory. In the end, Justinian did reunite much of the Roman Empire. Africa was Roman. Italy was Roman. Parts of southern Spain were Roman. On maps, the empire looked almost whole again, the Mediterranean nearly surrounded by imperial purple. But maps lie. The territories were conquered, but they weren't restored. Italy was a wasteland that would take centuries to recover. Africa, once the empire's breadbasket, was economically devastated. The costs of conquest had strained every imperial system to the breaking point, and the conquests were fragile. Within decades of Justinian's death, much of what he'd won would be lost again. The Lombards would invade Italy, taking everything except coastal enclaves. The Visigoths would push Byzantine forces out of Spain. Even parts of Africa would fall to Berber insurgencies. The Great Reconquest, which had consumed decades and enormous resources, which had devastated the very territories it claimed to liberate, which had turned Italy into a cemetery and Africa into a militarized zone, it would prove temporary. The dream of Renovatio Imperii would die with the dreamer. But the cost wasn't temporary. The damage was real. The lives lost, the cities destroyed, the ancient heritage burned or melted or smashed. That was permanent. Justinian had tried to turn back time, to restore what had been. Instead, he had accelerated decline, exhausted his empire's strength, pursuing a vision that was already obsolete. The mosaic of empire that he tried to restore lay in pieces, and the effort to fit those pieces back together had shattered them further. Part 5. The Apocalypse. The Plague of Justinian. The Ships from Egypt. Then came the invisible army that no legion could resist. In 541, ships arrived from Egypt, their holds filled with grain, the grain that fed Constantinople, that supported the empire's massive capital, that made possible Justinian's grand projects and military campaigns. But the grain ships carried another cargo, invisible and deadly. Rats, and in the rats, fleas. And in the fleas, Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague, making its first pandemic appearance in recorded history. We call it the Plague of Justinian, but that name does it a disservice, as if it were merely another episode in the emperor's eventful reign. It was so much more. It was the first pandemic of the Common Era, the Black Death's terrible ancestor, a demographic catastrophe that would reshape the ancient world more thoroughly than any military conquest could. It began quietly, with a handful of deaths in the port districts. Sailors, dock workers, grain inspectors, people whose jobs brought them into contact with the ships from Egypt. Within weeks, it was spreading through Constantinople's crowded neighborhoods. Within months, it had become catastrophe, the symptoms of apocalypse. The disease announced itself with fever and terrible weakness. Victims developed swellings, buboes in the groin, armpits, neck. These painful lumps would grow to the size of apples, filled with pus and blood. If they burst, the patient might survive. If they didn't, death typically followed within days. Some developed the pneumonic form, where the infection spread to the lungs. They coughed blood and died gasping, drowning in their own fluid. This form was even more contagious, spreading directly from person to person through the air. Others developed septicemic plague, where the infection entered the bloodstream directly. They turned black as their extremities necrotized, the origin of the name Black Death that would be applied to later outbreaks. The historian Procopius, who lived through the plague in Constantinople, described symptoms that sound like fever-induced hallucinations, victims seeing demons or experiencing visions before death. Some fell into deep stupor. Others became violently delirious. The disease seemed to attack not just bodies, but minds, as if mortality itself were becoming visible, and it killed with terrifying speed. A person might wake feeling slightly unwell and be dead by nightfall. Entire families would be wiped out in days. The mortality rate was catastrophic, perhaps 30 to 50% of those infected, possibly higher. The city of death. Constantinople, that golden city of 500,000 souls, became a necropolis. Procopius claimed that at the plague's height, 10,000 people were dying every day. This is probably an exaggeration, though not necessarily by much. Bodies piled in the streets because there weren't enough healthy people to bury them. Churches became impromptu morgues. Every available space was pressed into service as a burial ground. When the cemeteries overflowed, Justinian ordered the towers of the Psyche fortress across the Golden Horn be used as mass graves. Work crews removed the roofs and began stacking corpses inside, layer upon layer, until the towers were filled from floor to ceiling with the dead. The smell was unbearable. Ships entering the harbor could smell death from miles away. Eventually, even this wasn't enough. Bodies were loaded onto ships and taken out to sea, dumped overboard to sink or float away on the current. Others were piled in open trenches and burned, the pyres smoking day and night, creating a perpetual twilight of ash and grief. The living feared to touch the dead, worried that the disease might transfer through contact. But someone had to handle the bodies, so Justinian appointed officials specifically for corpse removal, paying them premium wages to do work that might kill them. Many of these workers died, and replacements had to be found. Then they died, and the cycle continued. Normal life ceased. Markets closed. Who wanted to handle goods that might carry infection? Churches held services, but attendance plummeted. The Hippodrome stood empty. The streets, usually crowded at all hours, became eerily quiet, except for the rumble of death carts and the wailing of mourners. The city's infrastructure began to fail. Bakers died, and bread became scarce. Aqueduct workers died, and water pressure dropped. Tax collectors died, and revenue dried up. The complex machine of urban civilization depended on thousands of people doing specialized jobs, and when those people died by the thousands, the machine ground to a halt. The emperor falls. Even Justinian, the sleepless emperor, could not escape. In the summer of 542, he fell ill with the characteristic symptoms: fever, swelling in the groin, delirium. For weeks, he lay near death. The bureaucrats who ran the empire waited in anxious uncertainty. Would he recover? Should they begin planning for a succession? Who would rule if he died? Theodora managed the crisis with her usual iron will. She controlled access to the emperor, maintained the fiction that he was still capable of ruling even when he lay unconscious, prevented ambitious generals or officials from making moves toward the throne. She held the empire together through sheer force of personality while her husband fought death. And somehow, miraculously, improbably, Justinian survived. Whether his naturally strong constitution or simply luck pulled him through, we'll never know. But he emerged from his sick room thinner, weaker, permanently changed. The man who awoke from plague fever was not quite the same man who had contracted it. His energy, that ceaseless drive that had earned him the nickname Sleepless, diminished. His faith deepened, but became more rigid, less tolerant of theological nuance. His suspicion of those around him, already pronounced, intensified into near paranoia. Some historians argue that Justinian's bout with plague marked a turning point in his reign. Before, energy, innovation, bold projects. After, caution, theological obsession, diminished ambition. Perhaps. Or perhaps the plague simply accelerated tendencies that were already present, burning away whatever remained of youth and optimism, leaving only the hardened core of will and control, the plague's empire-wide devastation. But Constantinople was only the beginning. The plague spread outward from the capital along the empire's trade routes, following the same paths that spread commerce and culture. Egypt was devastated, the same Egypt whose grain shipments had brought the plague to Constantinople. Syria, Palestine, Asia Minor, Greece, North Africa, Italy, every province felt its touch. Cities that had survived barbarian invasions, that had weathered economic decline and political chaos, were brought to their knees by invisible bacteria. The countryside suffered as much as cities. Farms were abandoned when entire families died. Fields went unploughed, harvests ungathered. The agricultural surplus that fed urban populations and supported military campaigns simply disappeared. Famine followed plague, and plague found populations weakened by famine easy targets for reinfection. The military campaigns in Italy ground to a halt. How could Belisarius prosecute a war when his supply lines were disrupted by plague? How could he recruit soldiers from a population being decimated by disease? The Gothic resurgence under King Totila happened partly because the plague had weakened Byzantine forces while leaving Gothic populations in the Italian interior relatively untouched. The fiscal impact was catastrophic. Justinian's grand projects depended on tax revenue, and tax revenue depended on a living, productive population. When perhaps a quarter to a third of the empire's population died, tax receipts collapsed. The emperor responded by raising taxes on survivors and increasing enforcement, which only added to the misery and drove more people to abandon their farms and flee to uncertain safety. Estimates of total mortality vary wildly. We simply don't have reliable demographic data. But modern scholars think perhaps 25 million people died during the initial outbreak and subsequent waves. In some regions, population may have fallen by half. Entire cities were depopulated. Some areas never fully recovered their pre-plague populations, even centuries later. The cycles of return, and the plague didn't end. It came back. The first outbreak, in 541 to 542, was the worst. But plague returned to Constantinople approximately every decade for the next 2 centuries. Each wave killed fewer people, partly because the most vulnerable had already died, partly because populations learned basic public health measures, partly because the bacteria itself may have evolved toward less lethal strains. But even these later outbreaks were devastating. A city would begin to recover, population would start growing again, economic activity would revive, and then plague would return, cutting down the recovery, resetting progress to zero. It was like trying to climb a mountain while an avalanche kept pushing you back down. The psychological impact was profound. People lived, knowing that death could come at any moment, that no precaution could guarantee safety, that the foundations of civilization, trade, urban life, concentrated populations actually increased vulnerability. Some turned to religious extremism, others to fatalism. The confident optimism that had characterized the early empire gave way to a darker, more pessimistic worldview. Justinian's grand vision of Renovatio Imperii had assumed a growing, prosperous population that could support his ambitions. The plague shattered that assumption. Instead of growing, the empire was shrinking. Instead of prospering, it was struggling to survive. The mosaic Justinian tried to create was bleeding away its tiles faster than he could place them. The changed world. The plague of Justinian marks one of history's great turning points, even if contemporaries didn't fully recognize it. Before the plague, the Byzantine Empire was wealthy, powerful, capable of projecting force across the Mediterranean. After the plague, it was permanently weakened, its population depleted, its tax base shrunken, its military capacity reduced. The empire would survive for another 9 centuries, but it would never again possess the resources that Justinian commanded. The plague also helped create the conditions for Islam's dramatic expansion a century later. The Byzantine and Persian empires, both weakened by repeated plague outbreaks, were unable to effectively resist Arab armies emerging from Arabia in the 600s. Provinces that should have been easily defended, Syria, Egypt, North Africa, fell with surprising speed to numerically inferior forces. The plague had hollowed out the empires, making them look strong from outside while being deeply fragile within. In a very real sense, the world we live in was shaped by Yersinia Pestis as much as by any emperor or general. The decline of Mediterranean trade, the ruralization of Europe, the weakening of urban culture, the shift of power northward toward regions less affected by plague, all these trends that defined the early Middle Ages had roots in the pandemic that ravaged Justinian's empire. Justinian survived the plague, but his vision did not. The man who had dreamed of unifying the world and building monuments to eternity now presided over an empire that was dying despite his every effort to save it. He continued to rule for another 23 years after recovering from his own infection. But those years would be marked by increasing difficulty, diminishing returns, and the slow realization that some forces, bacteria, death, demographic collapse, were beyond even an emperor's power to control. The Sleepless emperor had met an enemy that never slept, never negotiated, never cared about imperial authority or divine mission. And for the first time in his life, Justinian had been forced to retreat before a force he could neither outthink nor outwork. The plague was the crack in his mosaic that could never be repaired. And through that crack, the light that had illuminated his grand vision slowly began to dim. Part 6. The Theodora Factor. From the Hippodrome to the throne. If Justinian was mind and motion, Theodora was will. Her story reads like legend, almost too dramatic to be true, yet authenticated by sources both friendly and hostile. She was born into the lowest stratum of Byzantine society, in the shadow of the Hippodrome, where her father kept bears for the Green's animal shows. When Acacius died, Theodora's mother found herself with 3 daughters and no means of support. In desperation, she brought the girls before the Hippodrome crowd during a race day, hoping the Greens would take pity and offer employment. They refused. The Blues accepted, but the work they offered was performance, entertainment, spectacle. Theodora became an actress, which in 6th century Constantinople meant something far removed from modern theatrical respectability. Actresses occupied a social position barely above prostitution, sometimes indistinguishable from it. They performed in productions that mixed drama with eroticism, comedy with scandal. The historian Procopius, in his Secret History, a venomous exposé published after both Justinian and Theodora were dead, painted Theodora's early career in the lurid terms designed to titillate and horrify aristocratic readers. Some of his accounts were probably exaggerated, meant to disgrace her memory. But they captured a truth. Theodora had survived by any means necessary in a world that offered women of her class few choices. She traveled to North Africa as the companion of Hesebelus, a Syrian official appointed governor of Pentapolis. When he tired of her and abandoned her there, she was left destitute in a foreign land. Somehow she survived, made her way back to Constantinople, began rebuilding her life. She had seen the world from the bottom. She knew what it meant to be powerless, to be used and discarded, to have no one speak for you. That knowledge would shape everything she did from the throne. The conversion and the marriage. At some point during these years, Theodora underwent a genuine religious conversion. She became a devoted adherent of Monophysite Christianity, one of the theological variants that competed fiercely in the deeply divided Eastern Church. The Monophysites believed that Christ had one divine nature, not two natures, human and divine, as Orthodox Chalcedonian Christianity taught. This might seem like arcane theological hair-splitting to modern ears, but in 6th century Byzantium, such questions were matters of passionate conviction that could spark riots and rebellions. Theodora's conversion was apparently sincere. Throughout her life, she would protect Monophysite clergy, fund Monophysite monasteries, and work to soften Justinian's enforcement of Chalcedonian orthodoxy. When she met Justinian, he was still heir apparent, not yet emperor. Something extraordinary happened. He was perhaps 40 years old, she in her mid-20s. He was on the path to supreme power. She was an ex-actress trying to live respectably. By all conventional logic, she should have been a brief diversion, a mistress to be discarded when politically convenient. Instead, Justinian fell completely, enduringly in love. He saw in her not just beauty, but intelligence, not just survival instincts, but strategic brilliance. He saw someone who understood power in ways that senators' daughters, raised in protected luxury, never could. He saw an equal. But Roman law forbade senators from marrying actresses, and Justinian, as heir to the throne, was technically a senator. The law was explicit, its social logic clear. The senatorial class must remain pure, unsullied by mixing with the theatrical class. Justinian didn't care. He persuaded his uncle, Emperor Justin, to issue a decree specifically allowing such marriages. It was an extraordinary use of imperial power to overturn centuries of social custom for personal reasons. In 525, they married. In 527, when Justinian became emperor, Theodora became empress, not merely the emperor's wife, but co-ruler in fact, if not in name. Equal in power, Theodora's position was unprecedented. Previous empresses had wielded influence behind the scenes, through manipulation of their husbands or sons. Theodora ruled openly. Her image appeared alongside Justinian's on coins, in mosaics, in official documents. She held her own court, received her own embassies, issued her own orders. Foreign ambassadors learned that offending the empress could be as dangerous as offending the emperor. The famous mosaics at San Vitale in Ravenna show them as equal figures, facing each other across the apse, each surrounded by courtiers, each wearing the imperial purple. The artistic composition makes them balanced halves of a unified whole. This was intolerable to the aristocracy. Every decision she made, every order she issued, reminded them that a bearkeeper's daughter now commanded their obedience. Senators who could trace their lineage back to the Republic had to bow to a woman who had once performed on stage. Procopius's secret history is essentially a sustained scream of aristocratic rage at this inversion of the social order. His pornographic descriptions of Theodora's past, his claims of her cruelty and manipulation, his allegations of secret murders and conspiracies, all reflect the fury of a class that had been humiliated by her elevation. But Theodora had power, and she used it. The legislative champion. From the throne, Theodora became champion of the powerless, particularly women in situations similar to her own past. She sponsored laws banning forced prostitution and prohibiting brothel owners from keeping women against their will. This was revolutionary. In Byzantine society, prostitutes were considered barely human, possessing almost no legal rights. Brothel owners could effectively imprison women, keeping them in debt bondage that lasted lifetimes. Theodora's legislation made this illegal, giving these women, her former sisters, legal recourse and protection. She established a home called the Metanoia, repentance, on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, across the water from Constantinople. This wasn't just a shelter, it was a community where former prostitutes could live protected and supported as they rebuilt their lives. She provided them with education, training in respectable trades, and assistance finding marriages or other means of support. Some of the women, unable to adjust to their new lives or unwilling to accept the restrictions that came with respectability, committed suicide by throwing themselves from the building. This tragic detail, reported by hostile sources who used it to criticize Theodora, actually reveals the complexity of what she was attempting. These women had survived in one world and found themselves unable to live in another. The refuge she offered was genuine, but the gap between lives was sometimes too great to bridge. She reformed laws regarding inheritance, making it easier for women to retain property after their husbands' deaths. Byzantine inheritance law was complex and often favored male heirs, leaving widows dependent on the charity of their sons or forced into quick remarriages to maintain financial security. Theodora's reforms gave women more autonomy, more ability to control their own destinies. She strengthened laws against rape, increasing penalties and making it easier for victims to bring charges. She also pushed for reforms that recognized rape of slaves as a crime. Previously, slaves had been considered property without the legal right to refuse sexual contact. This was extraordinarily progressive for the time, treating slaves as human beings with bodily autonomy. She made divorce rights more reciprocal, allowing women to divorce husbands for cause rather than remaining trapped in abusive marriages. Previously, divorce had been largely a male prerogative. Women could be divorced easily, often losing their property and children in the process. But women initiating divorce faced enormous obstacles. Theodora's reforms didn't create equality, but they moved toward it, giving women more options to escape dangerous situations. She fought for the rights of actresses, those women who had been her sisters in poverty and exploitation, successfully pushing for legal reforms that granted them more protections and opportunities to leave the profession. Actresses were in a strange legal category, neither citizens nor slaves, with few rights and constant vulnerability to abuse. Theodora's legislation recognized them as human beings deserving of legal protection. These were not symbolic gestures, but substantial legal changes that improved the lives of thousands of women. Every reformed law meant women who would not be trapped in brothels, who would not lose their children after widowhood, who would not be forced to endure abusive marriages without recourse. These changes rippled through Byzantine society, slowly shifting assumptions about women's rights and human dignity. Her theological politics were more complicated and more consequential. She protected monophysite clergy even as Justinian tried to enforce Chalcedonian orthodoxy throughout the empire. She secretly sheltered monophysite bishops in the palace, maintaining a parallel religious establishment that sometimes contradicted official policy. This wasn't mere stubbornness or religious conviction. Though she certainly believed in monophysite doctrine, it was political calculation. The eastern provinces, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, were heavily monophysite. Harsh enforcement of Chalcedonian orthodoxy risked alienating these provinces, possibly driving them toward rebellion or at least passive resistance to imperial authority. By protecting monophysite clergy, by offering them refuge and maintaining communication with monophysite communities, Theodora gave the empire flexibility. Justinian could enforce orthodoxy where necessary without completely alienating dissent. She provided a safety valve, a back channel, a way for the empire to accommodate theological diversity even while officially demanding uniformity. She facilitated the appointment of monophysite bishops in areas where Chalcedonian appointments would have sparked resistance. She arranged for monophysite missionary work in regions beyond imperial borders. She even ordained monophysite priests in secret ceremonies held in the palace itself. This created a strange theological balance. Justinian enforcing orthodoxy, Theodora protecting dissent, the empire caught between them. Some historians argue that this was deliberate strategy, a a sophisticated good cop, bad cop arrangement that allowed the empire to maintain religious control while avoiding the kind of theological civil war that could have torn it apart. Others suggest genuine disagreement, a marriage that encompassed theological opposition. Justinian would issue an edict. Theodora would quietly undermine its enforcement. He would persecute monophysite bishops. She would hide them. He would insist on theological uniformity. She would preserve theological diversity. Either way, Theodora's influence moderated what might otherwise have been harsh persecution. The eastern provinces remained largely monophysite throughout Justinian's reign, but they remained loyal to the empire. This was partly Theodora's doing, her protection of their clergy, her respect for their convictions, her tacit acknowledgement that theological diversity was preferable to the alternative. The courage that saved an empire. But Theodora's greatest moment came during the Nika Riots, when her refusal to flee saved Justinian's throne and changed history. That speech in the council chamber, "Royalty is a good burial shroud," was not mere rhetoric. It was character revealed under pressure. Theodora, who had survived abandonment and destitution, who had clawed her way from nothing to the throne, was not going to surrender power because she was afraid. She had learned in the hardest school that retreat meant vulnerability, that showing weakness invited exploitation. Better to die fighting than to live as a fugitive. And she was right. Had Justinian fled, the rebellion would have succeeded. Hypatius would have become emperor. The senators would have regained control. All of Justinian's plans, Hagia Sophia, the legal codification, the Reconquest, would have died stillborn. Theodora saved not just Justinian's throne, but his legacy. Without her courage in that moment, none of what followed would have been possible. The loss that broke him. In 548, Theodora fell ill, probably cancer, though the sources don't provide enough detail for certain diagnosis. She weakened gradually, her formidable strength ebbing away over months. Justinian, who had faced down mobs and armies and plague, was helpless. All his power, all his resources, could not stop death from taking the one person he loved. She died on June 28, 548. She was perhaps 48 years old. The palace darkened. Chroniclers report that Justinian never smiled again. For 17 more years he would rule, but the light that had balanced his intensity, that had softened his harshness, that had reminded him of humanity amid the abstractions of empire, that light was gone. After Theodora's death, Justinian became more withdrawn, more obsessed with theology, more suspicious of those around him. His later years were marked by theological controversies that consumed his energy, while the empire's borders contracted and its problems multiplied. He had lost the one person who could tell him no, who could challenge him, who could remind him that power existed to serve people, not people to serve power. The man who had tried to mosaic the world now wandered through its broken pieces, rearranging them in memory, unable to complete the pattern without her. Theodora's legacy extends beyond her legislation or her courage. She proved that power was not hereditary, that ability and will could overcome the circumstances of birth, that a woman from the absolute bottom of society could rule an empire and rule it well. Her life was a living challenge to every assumption about class and gender that structured Byzantine society. She forced the empire to acknowledge that worth was not determined by birth, that wisdom could come from unexpected sources, that the powerful did not have a monopoly on virtue or intelligence. In a society obsessed with hierarchy and purity of lineage, Theodora was a living contradiction, and she made that contradiction glorious. Part 7. The Empty Victory and the Long Shadow, the Theologian Emperor. Old age found Justinian still awake long after the world slept. He no longer marched armies or raised domes. The energy that had defined his early reign, that had driven him through 18-hour days and midnight strategy sessions, that had made him the sleepless emperor, that energy had been burned away by plague and grief and time. Now he wrote theology, and in his theological writings we see a mind trying to control what it could no longer physically dominate. Justinian had always been deeply religious, but after Theodora's death, theological speculation became obsession. He wrote treatises on the nature of Christ, on the relationship between divine and human natures, on points of doctrine so subtle that even bishops struggled to follow his reasoning. He would spend hours debating fine distinctions of theological language, parsing Greek terms with the same precision he had once applied to legal codes. He convened church councils to resolve theological disputes, then became angry when the bishops couldn't agree, couldn't see the obvious truth that seemed so clear to him. How could they not understand? How could trained theologians fail to reach the conclusions that were, to his mind, logically inevitable? He issued edicts on religious practice, attempting to legislate orthodoxy with the same precision he had brought to civil law. Bishops were ordered to preach certain doctrines, to avoid certain formulations, to interpret scripture in approved ways. He created theological loyalty oaths, required clergy to sign statements of belief, punished those who deviated from approved doctrine. It was as if he believed he could debate God into submission, that faith could be organized as systematically as the corpus juris, that the mysteries of divinity could be solved through legislation and logical argument. If he could just find the right formulation, the perfect synthesis, then all theological disagreement would resolve itself. Unity would be achieved not through force, but through irresistible logic. His 3 chapters controversy consumed the last decade of his life and accomplished nothing except alienating nearly everyone. The controversy centered on whether to condemn certain 5th century theologians whose writings were considered problematic by monophysites. Justinian thought that condemning these writings, the 3 chapters, might reconcile monophysites to Chalcedonian Christianity without actually abandoning Chalcedonian doctrine. It was an attempt at having it both ways, at threading a theological needle so fine that it might satisfy both sides. In practice, it satisfied neither. The Pope initially resisted, arguing that condemning texts approved by previous councils undermined the authority of those councils. Justinian responded by having him arrested and brought to Constantinople, not executed but imprisoned, humiliated, eventually forced to sign the condemnation. This display of imperial power over the Church alienated Western Christians, who saw it as confirmation that Constantinople cared more about theological abstractions than about Christian unity. Eastern bishops split into factions. Some supported the condemnation, others opposed it. Still others signed it while privately maintaining their previous positions. The monophysites, whom the whole exercise was meant to conciliate, remained unreconciled. They saw the condemnation as inadequate, as not going far enough, as confirming that Chalcedonian Christianity was fundamentally incompatible with their beliefs. Years of correspondence, councils, edicts, arguments, all producing no lasting resolution, just exhaustion and mutual resentment. This was Justinian in his final years, a man trying to solve through intellect and will problems that required wisdom and compromise. He had the intellect and the will in abundance, but wisdom had deserted him when Theodora died, and compromise had never been his strength. He was trying to complete her work, perhaps, to find the religious synthesis she had embodied, to bridge the gap between competing Christianities, but without her political instinct, her ability to read people and situations, her understanding that some problems cannot be solved but only managed, his efforts became merely pedantic. The emperor who had codified 1,000 years of law, who had imposed order on the chaos of Roman jurisprudence, could not codify faith. Belief resists systematization. Mystery cannot be reduced to propositions. The human heart does not follow logical syllogisms. And yet he kept trying, kept writing, kept arguing, kept issuing edicts, as if enough words could finally capture what was inherently uncapturable. His theological works fill volumes, dense, learned, sophisticated, ultimately futile. They are monuments to the limits of human reason, testaments to what even the greatest intellect cannot achieve. In 565, shortly before his death, he issued one final theological edict, affirming a monophysite-leaning interpretation of Christ's nature. It was arguably heretical by Chalcedonian standards, a betrayal of the orthodox position he had spent decades enforcing. His successor immediately repudiated it. Even this final statement, this last attempt at theological synthesis, accomplished nothing except confusion and controversy. Justinian died, having failed in his theological mission as thoroughly as he had succeeded in his legal one. Perhaps the difference was that law governs behavior while theology addresses belief. You can legislate actions, but you cannot legislate conviction. You can punish heresy, but you cannot compel faith. This was a lesson Justinian never quite learned, despite decades of frustration proving it over and over. The crumbling borders. While Justinian debated theology, the empire's borders contracted. In the east, Persia under Khosrow I proved a formidable enemy. The peace that had held for decades broke down. Persian armies invaded Syria, sacking Antioch in 540, one of the greatest cities in the Christian world, reduced to ashes. Justinian had to buy peace with gold, essentially paying tribute to the Persian king he had hoped to humble. In the west, the Reconquest was already unraveling. Italy, barely pacified, required constant military presence and resources the empire could no longer spare. Byzantine control was limited to a few coastal cities and garrison towns. The interior reverted to local control or simply chaos. In the Balkans, Slavic tribes crossed the Danube in increasing numbers. The frontier that had held for centuries was dissolving. These weren't organized invasions, but a slow migration, populations filtering through weakened defenses, settling in imperial territory, gradually transforming the demographic composition of the Balkans. Justinian lacked the resources to stop them. The plague had decimated the military recruitment base. The Italian campaigns had exhausted the treasury. The administrative apparatus was stretched beyond capacity. The empire that had seemed resurgent in 540, with Africa reconquered, Rome reclaimed, Hagia Sophia completed, the law codified, was by 560 struggling simply to maintain what it held. The final years. In his final years, Justinian became a figure of tragedy. He had lived too long, seen too much, outlasted his own era. Most of his contemporaries were dead. Belisarius had died in 565, possibly blind, certainly impoverished. The loyal general who had saved the empire repeatedly, rewarded with suspicion and neglect. Theodora was gone. The courtiers and advisors who had helped build his early achievements had been replaced by a new generation that didn't remember the Nika Riots or the African campaign. Justinian sat in his palace, white-bearded and hollow-eyed, working late into the night by lamplight. Still sleepless, still driven, but now the drive had no direction, the sleeplessness no purpose except habit. He reviewed endless reports of border incursions he couldn't stop. He read theological treatises that no one else cared about. He issued edicts that provincial governors increasingly ignored. The machinery of empire still functioned, but it no longer responded to his will with the immediacy it once had. The empire was running on momentum, not vision, and momentum inevitably slows. He had nightmares about the Hippodrome, or so some sources claim. The ghosts of 30,000 people, killed on his orders, demanding to know what their deaths had purchased. In those dreams, the answer was harder to articulate than it had been in 532, when the blood was fresh and the justification obvious. Death and the reckoning. Justinian died on November 14th, 565. He was 83 years old, had ruled for 38 years. He died in his sleep peacefully, surrounded by documents, working literally until his final day. The empire mourned. How could it not? He had been emperor for nearly 4 decades, had reshaped every aspect of imperial life, had been the one constant in an era of dramatic change. But the morning was complicated by uncertainty. What exactly had he accomplished? He had built Hagia Sophia, the most magnificent church in Christendom. But the empire's finances were exhausted, its provincial cities struggling, its infrastructure decaying. He had codified Roman law, creating a legal system that would outlast the empire itself. But he had also created a more autocratic, more bureaucratic, more oppressive administrative state. He had reconquered Africa and Italy, but Africa was still unstable, and Italy was devastated. The Reconquest had cost more than it gained, had weakened the empire to achieve a symbolic victory. He had survived the plague, but the plague had permanently weakened the empire's demographic and economic foundations, creating vulnerabilities that would become critical in coming centuries. The treasury that Justinian's uncle Justin had left full was empty. The army that had once projected power across 3 continents was overextended and underfunded. The provinces that had been prosperous were exhausted by taxation. The population that had been growing was still recovering from plague. His successor, Justin II, would inherit an empire that looked magnificent, but was fundamentally weakened. A facade of strength, concealing structural fragility. The verdict of history. So what are we to make of Justinian? He was, without question, one of history's most consequential rulers. His legal code shaped Western law for a millennium and continues to influence civil law systems today. His architectural achievements, especially Hagia Sophia, remain wonders of human creativity. His ambition and vision were extraordinary, but consequence is not the same as success, and vision is not the same as wisdom. He dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire, of turning back time to an imagined golden age when Rome ruled the Mediterranean and civilization flourished under imperial order. But that dream was already obsolete when he conceived it. The world had changed. The Germanic kingdoms in the West had been established for generations. Their populations saw them as legitimate. The cultural and economic integration that had made the Roman Empire possible no longer existed. You cannot restore what was by destroying what is. And that, ultimately, was Justinian's failure. He looked backward when he should have looked forward. He tried to rebuild the past when he should have been building the future. The Italian campaign is the clearest example. He reconquered Italy, yes, but in the process, he destroyed it. The Italy that emerged from 20 years of Gothic wars was a devastated wasteland, its population decimated, its infrastructure destroyed, its cities depopulated. He saved Italy from the Goths by annihilating Italian civilization. Was this victory? In the narrow sense that Italy once again acknowledged Byzantine authority, yes. In any meaningful sense, no. The cost exceeded the benefit by orders of magnitude. Italy would have been better off remaining under Gothic rule than being liberated by Justinian's armies. And the Reconquest didn't even last. Within decades, the Lombards invaded and took most of what Justinian had won. The devastation was permanent. The conquest was temporary. He had traded lasting damage for temporary gain. The same pattern appears throughout his reign. Hagia Sophia is magnificent, but building it required taxation so heavy that it contributed to economic decline across the empire. The Corpus Juris is brilliant, but codifying law did nothing to address the structural problems, demographic decline, fiscal crisis, border insecurity, that actually threatened the empire's survival. He addressed symptoms rather than causes, focused on symbolic victories rather than practical solutions. He wanted to be remembered as a new Augustus, a restorer of Rome, but Augustus built on strength. Justinian built on exhaustion. Augustus created a system that would endure for centuries. Justinian exhausted the system he inherited. And yet, we cannot dismiss him entirely, because buried in the failures are genuine achievements that transcended his own limitations. Consider the legal code. Yes, it didn't solve the empire's practical problems, but it preserved Roman legal thought at the exact moment when that preservation was most needed. Without Justinian's Corpus Juris, we might not have the legal tradition that underpins Western civilization. The the recovery of Roman law in the medieval period, one of the crucial intellectual events of European history, depended on texts that Justinian's commission produced. This wasn't his intention. He wasn't trying to preserve legal thought for medieval scholars. He was trying to organize his own empire's legal system. But intentions matter less than consequences, and the consequence was that he saved something immensely valuable from potential oblivion. Similarly with Hagia Sophia. Yes, it was built through exploitation and overtaxation. Yes, it represents the emperor's vanity as much as his piety, but it also represents human genius achieving something genuinely transcendent. That dome, floating impossibly above its square base, remains one of the supreme achievements of human architecture. Its influence shaped church design for a millennium, inspired countless imitations, proved that human beings could create beauty that approached the divine. Was the cost worth it? That's the question that haunts any assessment of Justinian. Do great achievements justify terrible costs? Can we celebrate the art while acknowledging the exploitation that produced it? Should we? History provides no clear answer. The suffering of those who built Hagia Sophia was real and terrible. Their lives were shortened, their health destroyed, their families impoverished to create imperial glory. And yet, the building stands and moves people to tears, and proclaims across 15 centuries that human beings once reached upward and touched something transcendent. Perhaps both things can be true simultaneously, that Justinian was a tyrant who crushed his own people, and that he was a visionary who created lasting beauty, that he failed in his fundamental mission while succeeding in ways he never anticipated, that his reign was both triumph and tragedy, sometimes in the same act. This ambiguity is uncomfortable. We want our historical figures to be clearly good or clearly evil, to be celebrated or condemned without reservation. Justinian resists such simplification. He was too complex, too contradictory, too simultaneously brilliant and destructive to fit into easy categories. He massacred 30,000 people to save his throne, then built churches to God's glory. He codified law to create justice, then used that law to persecute dissent. He reconquered the West to restore Roman civilization, then destroyed that civilization through the Reconquest. He elevated a prostitute to Empress and treated her as an equal, then persecuted other religious minorities without mercy. He was all of this, all at once, and we must hold these contradictions in mind if we are to understand him truly. What would Justinian himself say if he could know how history remembers him? He would probably be frustrated that his military conquests are seen as failures, that the restoration he worked so hard to achieve proved temporary. He would be disappointed that his theological works are forgotten, that his attempts at religious unity accomplished nothing lasting. But he would surely be pleased, perhaps even awed, that his legal code endures, that lawyers and judges 15 centuries later still study principles his commission established. He would be proud that Hagia Sophia stands, that his dome still catches the light, that visitors still emerge from the church speaking of transcendence and beauty. He wanted to be remembered as the emperor who restored Rome. Instead, he is remembered as the emperor who tried to restore Rome, and in failing, created something new and unexpected. His legal code became the foundation of a legal tradition he never imagined. His church inspired an architectural style he never anticipated. His reign marked not restoration, but transformation. Not a return to the past, but a bridge to a different future. This is perhaps his true legacy, not what he intended to build, but what his efforts produced despite his intentions. The law that outlasted empires. The architecture that transcended its original purpose. The demonstration that human will and vision, even when misdirected, can create things that endure long after the creator's dreams have turned to dust. The two creations that endured, two of Justinian's creations genuinely achieved immortality. The law. The Corpus Juris Civilis survived the fall of Constantinople, survived the end of the Byzantine Empire, survived the Middle Ages. It was rediscovered, studied, became the foundation of European legal education. It influenced the development of international law, constitutional law, administrative law. When judges today cite precedent, when lawyers argue from principle, when law students learn to think systematically about justice, they are, at several removes, following patterns that Justinian established. The Church. Hagia Sophia still stands in Istanbul, nearly 1,500 years after its completion. It has been a Christian church, an Islamic mosque, a museum, and now a mosque again. Its dome still floats, seemingly weightless. Its proportions still evoke awe. It remains proof that human beings, given sufficient will and resources, can create beauty that transcends time. These are not small achievements. These are contributions to civilization that place Justinian among the most important figures in human history. But they came at terrible cost. Cost paid not by Justinian, but by the people he ruled. The peasants taxed into poverty, the soldiers who died in Italy, the workers who built Hagia Sophia, the 30,000 killed in the Hippodrome, the millions who died of plague, while the emperor's building projects consumed resources that might have mitigated the disaster. The mosaic complete yet broken. Justinian had tried to create a mosaic, to take the scattered fragments of Roman civilization and arrange them into a coherent, beautiful whole. In some ways, he succeeded. The law was codified, the church was built, the West was temporarily reunited, the empire survived. But mosaics are fragile. They depend on each tile remaining in place, on the mortar holding, on no one striking them too hard. And Justinian's mosaic was struck repeatedly by plague, by war, by the inherent impossibility of his vision. By the time of his death, the mosaic was still visible, still recognizable. But tiles were falling out. The pattern was disintegrating. The beauty remained, but so did the cracks. His successors would try to maintain what he built, but they lacked his vision and his resources. Within a century, much of what he had achieved would be lost. The western provinces would fall again. The treasury would remain empty. The empire would contract toward its Anatolian and Balkan core. But even as the political empire diminished, Justinian's cultural and intellectual achievements endured. The law books continued to be copied. Hagia Sophia continued to inspire. The memory of Byzantine glory, that brief moment when it seemed Rome might truly be restored, continued to fire imaginations. The final reflection. Standing in Hagia Sophia today, looking up at that dome that still seems to float, it's easy to see Justinian's vision, the belief that human beings could touch the divine, that beauty could be made manifest, that civilization could conquer chaos. Reading the digest, encountering the systematic thought, the logical organization, the effort to create justice through reason, it's easy to admire his ambition, the belief that law could be perfected, that society could be rationally organized, that human wisdom could accumulate and improve across generations. But knowing the cost, the suffering, the death, the exhaustion of an empire, it's impossible not to question whether the achievement justified the price. Justinian would have said yes, without hesitation. He believed he was doing God's work, restoring God's empire, building monuments to God's glory. He believed that individual suffering was regrettable but necessary, that generations would bless his name for what he built. And in a sense, he was right. We do remember him. We do admire his achievements. The law and the dome endure. But we also remember the 30,000 dead in the Hippodrome. We remember Italy devastated to save it. We remember an empire exhausted by one man's grand vision. Justinian was neither pure hero nor pure villain. He was something more complex and more human, a man of extraordinary gifts and extraordinary flaws, whose vast ambitions achieved lasting greatness at terrible cost. He was the sleepless emperor, and he built an empire that never truly slept, because it never recovered from the effort he demanded. Epilogue. The sleepless emperor rests at last. In the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, a church he himself had rebuilt, Justinian was laid to rest beside Theodora. The couple who had saved the empire during the Nika Riots, who had ruled together for 21 years until death separated them, were reunited in death. The church that held their tombs would stand for 900 years before being demolished to make way for the Fatih Mosque after Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453. Their bodies are lost now, the tombs destroyed, even their exact location within the church uncertain. But the world they shaped endures. When you sign a contract and trust that it will be enforced, you are living in Justinian's world. When you study law and learn to distinguish principles from precedents, you are thinking with tools he forged. When you enter any building with a dome, when you see light filtering through windows in stone, when you witness architecture attempting to capture something beyond mere function, you are seeing visions that Hagia Sophia made possible. He tried to reverse time, and time punished him. He tried to restore what had been, and history showed that restoration is impossible, that the past cannot be rebuilt, only reimagined. But pieces of his vision, glittering, eternal, indestructible, still shine across the ages like gold mosaic under plaster. The empire he tried to restore failed, but the civilization he tried to preserve survived, transformed, spread far beyond anything he could have imagined. His law books reached places Rome never conquered. His architectural innovations inspired churches and mosques and temples in lands the empire never knew. He was a man born of peasant stock who died as the most powerful ruler on earth. He married a woman born in poverty and made her empress. He massacred thousands to save his throne, then built monuments to God's glory. He codified law and made war. He built churches and burned cities. He saved Roman civilization and exhausted the empire that carried it. He was contradiction made emperor, ambition made flesh, vision made disaster and triumph in equal measure. And the world he tried to rebuild still reflects his restless light. Like a mosaic, incomplete yet radiant. Like a dome, impossible yet standing. Like a code of law created for one empire but surviving for all time. Justinian sleeps now, but his legacy never rests. It lives in every lawbook, in every dome, in every dream of building something eternal from temporary materials. The Sleepless Emperor taught us this, that human beings can create works that outlast empires, that beauty and order can be wrested from chaos, that individual genius can reshape civilization, and that the cost of such achievements is always higher and more human than we want to admit. He was the last Roman and the first Byzantine. He was the man who tried to turn back time and instead pushed history forward. He was the emperor who wanted to be remembered as a new Augustus, but became instead something unprecedented. Justinian, the sleepless, the builder, the lawgiver, the conqueror who lost, the victor who failed, the man who rebuilt the world and nearly destroyed it. His story ends, but the questions his life raises never stop echoing. What are we willing to sacrifice for greatness? What costs are justified by lasting achievements? Can individual vision reshape civilization? Or does civilization inevitably crush individual dreams? Is it better to attempt the impossible and fail magnificently than to settle for modest success? Justinian answered these questions with his life. The world is still deciding whether he was right. But standing in Istanbul, looking up at Hagia Sophia's dome, watching sunlight pour through ancient windows, seeing that impossible structure still floating after 15 centuries, in that moment, the questions fade. Some achievements transcend judgment. Some beauty exists beyond ethics. Some visions, once realized, become eternal regardless of the cost required to create them. Justinian knew this. He bet everything on it. And in gold, in stone, in law, in the shape of a dome against the sky, he won his immortality. The sleepless emperor rests at last, but we are still living in his dream. The end.